And welcome to Chapter 1, where we start kind of our lectures and what we're looking at in this whole idea of economics. So in this particular chapter, you're going to run into a lot of words that mean something totally different to an economist than what they mean in society as a whole. So as we go through the slides, I'm going to underline those words and kind of give you some definitions for them so that as you read chapters and whatnot, you can easily understand, or at least better understand, what we mean in economic thought by those particular words. So without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen with you. Okay, so here we're looking at the 10 principles of economics, and our first objective in this chapter is to talk about how economists, really what we do is we study this idea of scarce resources. We will find that economists mean that all resources are scarce. We'll talk very briefly and then define a little bit later on what it means to think at the margin. Lastly, and probably more importantly, is how do individuals maximize utility? Okay, so there's a first word that I kind of want to define. Utility is the want-satisfying power of a good or service. So how well does it meet your expectations? Okay. And we're going to see that this is subject to budget limitations. When we talk about maximization of utility, we're going to say individuals do things as long as the benefit of that activity outweighs the cost of engaging in that activity. We know that individuals will continue to make decisions as long as the benefit outweighs the cost. Once the benefit becomes equal to the cost, then individuals will no longer do that. So that's kind of an essential kind of concept that we have in economics. Before we dip into economics as a whole, we first have to take a look at the root word, which is the economy. And what do we mean by an economy? Well, for us, the definition of an economy is one who manages a household. So take a question and say, okay, do you manage a household? This is one of those weird words in society that you probably, many of you would have said no, because you don't see yourself as a head of household as defined by the U.S. Census. However, what we mean in economics as a household is anyone who makes buying decisions. So therefore, all of us are households. Okay? So households are dependent in the economy. They're a major player in the economy. So why do people buy things? What if we all stopped buying things at the same time? We would see that the economy would falter greatly. Okay, to our second point. In making buying decisions, we face many decisions. And if you think about it, what's the two things that you can never have enough of? And most students will answer money, and they will answer time. These are good ideas of the scarcity of resources. You might want to do many things with your paycheck. However, what you have to take into account is what is the benefit of doing that action? And in some ways, what's the cost of not doing it? Okay? So paying your bills versus not paying your bills. Okay? So again, some of the things that we take into account. Now, what we try to do as all of us in households is we become a society, and we face many decisions on what's the best way to spend our resources to get the maximum benefit for that, or the maximum utility. Now, economists believe all resources are scarce, every single one you can think of. Now, a lot of people like to challenge this assumption, and so let's think of some resources which are seemingly abundant and plentiful, And then you'll find that they're maybe not as plentiful when you look at it in terms of the lens of an economist. Oftentimes, students will say air. Air is very plentiful. But if you think about air for a moment, is there a difference in air quality? And we know that individuals with allergies and those kinds of things will spend money, resources, to try and lessen on HEPA filters, for example, and to make their air cleaner so they can breathe better. Another one that many students often say that's plentiful is water. And if you think about water, yes, it's seemingly plentiful. However, you can die of thirst on the ocean because it's salt water. So clean, drinkable water is a scarce resource. And we've seen that in like the Flint water crisis and so on. Because if we make the assertion, and we will for the duration of this course, that all resources are scarce, then we have to think about what are the best ways to maximize those resources. So what economics actually is the study of how we manage these scarce resources. One other term that I want to define a little bit better here are resources. And by resources, what we mean in economics are the factors of production. And factors of production, there are actually 6, but we're only going to be looking at 3. They are land, labor, and capital. Okay, land is just that, all the geographic area, as well as all natural resources which come from that area. Labor, the number of people that are able to contribute to the workforce, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in upcoming chapters, how labor could be subdivided into human capital as well as individuals. The last one, capital, here is sometimes misunderstood because it means something different in society than it does here to economics. Most people in society think it means money, but in terms of economic thought, what we mean is anything that we use to produce a good or a service. So many times it is machinery. Okay, it's not money. That's an important point. So by capital, here's a good example. If we have a farmer and they're going to produce wheat, they're using a tractor to produce the wheat, and that tractor becomes capital. They're not producing tractors, they're producing wheat, but they use that tractor to produce the wheat as a whole. What we study, the 3 basic categories in economics, the first one is looking at why people make the decisions that they do. And as we said, we're going to say that an individual makes a decision as long as the benefit of that decision is greater than the cost of that decision. Now, this is an individual's belief. So we might ask ourselves, well, what about drug addiction? Well, that's because the benefit in the moment to a person addicted outweighs the cost in the longer term. So many times how we frame this will change up the cost benefit. We also look in economics at a thing called Pareto efficiency. Okay? And Pareto efficiency basically says that if we can make one individual better off without making anyone worse off, then we should go ahead and engage in that. Pareto efficiency says that we cannot make anyone better off without making someone worse off. So again, the benefit to society is equal to the cost to society. The second category that we look at is how people interact with one another. Why do individuals do what they do? And the third and last category that we put the 10 principles in are these forces and trends. Your course, macroeconomics, spends some time here in the first portion because we need to understand how individuals make decisions. We'll talk a little bit about households and businesses and how they interact with one another. So we'll take it at a very grand scale because we are macroeconomics. And we spend a lot of time in our course, several chapters, looking at this third, the trends and forces, things like unemployment, things like gross domestic product, consumer price index, all of these kinds of things. And that's really where your course spends most of its time. We can now take the 10 principles of economics. The 10 principles of economics are those things that most economists believe. Now, I've seen them as 7 and 6, but the principles really, your author, Greg Mankiw, breaks them down into 10 basic premises that we believe as economists will always be true. And sometimes if you can't figure out a problem, you come back and you think about which principle can be applied to that problem, and it will help you get the answer a lot better. Okay, so let's jump back into our slides. Okay, so the first one is that we make trade-offs in terms of how we make decisions. Every decision that we make involves a trade-off. And it's interesting, the older that I get, the more I understand this. So if you choose to do A, then you're not doing B. And there's like a cost that comes associated with that. We're going to term this thing the opportunity cost. And I think if you don't get anything else in chapter 1, you want to understand the opportunity cost. The second one is the cost of something is what you give up to get it. Again, the idea of maximizing utility and that the benefit of that action outweighs the cost. Principle 3, rational people think at the margin. And I don't want you to get tied up in rational at this point. But what I'd like you to look at is this idea of margin. And when we talk about margin and marginality, we mean incremental. So that's another word. So instead of looking at total costs, we might look at our cost as we move from an output of 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3. That's marginality in economics. The fourth principle is that people respond to incentives. And sometimes people respond to incentives where the government has set up something that perhaps gives people an incentive to do the wrong action. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to that principle. Principles 5 through 6 talk about how the economy interacts and how households and businesses interact with one another. In chapter 3, we're going to talk about Principle 5, the idea that trade and specialization of labor can make everyone better off in society. I always like to add in the long term because it's difficult to tell people who have just lost their job that they're better off because we're trading with a country where their job may have been lost too. Principle 6 is markets. And again, we're going to kind of take a really big, broad brushstroke at this. And we're going to talk about households and individuals in a market situation. Microeconomics studies this a lot more in depth. Okay. The last one is that governments can sometimes improve market outcomes. And by that we mean when we talk about a market outcome in this class, excuse me, we mean market efficiency. And a market is efficient as long as we can get to quantity equilibrium and we can get to price equilibrium. Now, again, this is a little bit more for microeconomics than it is for macroeconomics, and so we don't discuss these quite as much as the other courses do. You're going to spend most of your time on principles 8 through 10, and this is the first one. The 8th principle talks about the standard of living. And it depends on our ability to produce goods and services. So because we need to produce things and we're able to produce things, that means that we need households to produce them. Think about where you get your money. You get your money from selling your labor, or you get your money from some other source. So when we talk about this, the ability to produce goods and services, we're going to look at this in our chapter 23, and we call that gross domestic product, or GDP. Principle 9 talks about prices, and prices we're going to look at in chapter 24, which is the Consumer Price Index. We're then going to talk about some other principles, and we're going to talk about this idea of the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Now, most people think that inflation is a bad thing. It's really not. The right amount of inflation is important to an economy. Too much inflation, then we have issues. But the 10th principle really talks about why might the government create inflation? Because it will make the unemployment rate decrease temporarily. Okay, that is the end of our first learning objective for chapter 1, and I'll see you back for chapter 1, learning objective 2. And until then, take care, be safe, and have a great day.